My name is Elena Reyes, and I was never meant to be memorable. That was their first mistake. He called me a meaningless cog right in the middle of a strategy meeting, in front of the entire newly recruited team. But there was something he didn't know. I was the one who held the key to the company's entire supply chain. I didn't react, didn't say a word, but in my head, I was already planning how to make the empire he so confidently built crumble piece by piece. They thought I was a replaceable employee. A few weeks later, their factories were as silent as graveyards, and I was signing an exclusive contract with their competitor. Tuesday morning at Arcvilas Dynamics always began with the weekly executive strategy meeting. The sleek conference room on the 37th floor offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a backdrop to the corporate theater that was about to unfold. I arrived early as usual, laptop tucked under my arm, notes meticulously prepared. 6 years at this company had taught me to be 3 steps ahead of everyone else. The room gradually filled with familiar faces, department heads, senior managers, and today, several new additions to the executive team. These new recruits had been handpicked by our recently appointed COO, Trent Halverson, a man whose credentials consisted primarily of being the CEO's brother-in-law and having an MBA from a prestigious university. His 3 months at Arcvilas had been marked by restructurings, reassignments, and a palpable tension that had never existed before. "Good morning, everyone," Trent announced as he strode in precisely at 9:00 a.m. Not a second earlier or later. His tailored suit and perfect Windsor knot projected the image of corporate competence. Let's begin with departmental updates. Production. The meeting progressed through the standard agenda. Marketing reported on the upcoming product launch. Finance discussed quarterly projections. HR mentioned ongoing recruitment efforts. Then it was my turn. "Supply chain," Trent said, nodding in my direction without making eye contact. I stood, calm and collected. "Thank you. I'm pleased to report that despite regional instability in South America, our supply of Titan Barat matrix remains stable. I've secured commitments from our Port Arevalo partners for the next 6 quarters, which puts us ahead of projected need even with the expansion plans." I continued with details about shipping timelines, inventory optimization, and cost savings measures implemented over the past month. The room was silent when I finished, not from lack of interest, but because my department was the only one consistently exceeding expectations. In a company that manufactured specialized components for aerospace and defense industries, the supply chain was our lifeline, particularly regarding the Titan Barat matrix, a compound essential to our products and available only from a single source in South America. I expected the usual nod of acknowledgement, perhaps even a rare word of approval. Instead, Trent leaned back in his chair, an artificial smile forming on his lips. "Thank you, Elena," he said, my name sounding foreign on his tongue. "That's adequate. But let's not overstate the importance of individual contributions here." He turned to address the new executives. "The beauty of corporate structure is that everyone is replaceable. Even our supply chain director is just a cog in the machine." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. A few uncomfortable glances were exchanged. Sarah from HR looked down at her tablet. Marcus from legal suddenly became very interested in his coffee cup. "We can train anyone to maintain these relationships." Trent continued. "It's about systems, not people. Remember that as you build your teams." I remained standing for a moment, the silence deafening. Then, with practiced composure, I sat down, my expression neutral despite the burn of humiliation. 6 years of dedication, of solving problems no one else could solve, reduced to being just a cog. What Trent Halverson didn't understand, what nobody in that room fully grasped, was that I wasn't a cog at all. I was the oil that kept the entire machine running. And without oil, even the most sophisticated machinery grinds to a catastrophic halt. Few people at Arcvilas understood the true nature of our supply chain, particularly regarding the Titan Barat matrix. The compound wasn't simply ordered through standard procurement channels. It came from a highly specialized laboratory in Port Arevalo, owned and operated by Ayla Vargas, a brilliant chemist with a deep distrust of corporate America and a penchant for personal relationships over institutional ones. I had been sent to Port Arevalo 6 years ago as a last resort. 3 previous supply chain managers had failed to secure a reliable supply line. The company was desperate, operating with dwindling reserves of the compound, when they dispatched me, then just a supply chain analyst with a background in international relations. Just get us something. My previous boss had said, anything is better than nothing. What the company didn't know was that I had spent the previous 6 months preparing. I'd learned Spanish and Portuguese, studied the regional history, memorized local customs, and researched Ayla Vargas's personal history extensively. I arrived in Port Arevalo not as a corporate representative, but as someone who understood the value of personal connection. The laboratory was situated on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, a modern facility that contrasted sharply with the colonial architecture of the surrounding town. My first meeting with Ayla had been scheduled for 30 minutes. We talked for 5 hours. She spoke of her family's history in the region, of her grandfather's discovery of the unique mineral composition that would eventually lead to the development of the Titan Barate matrix. I shared stories of my own family, of my grandmother who had emigrated from Mexico, of growing up between 2 cultures. We found common ground in unexpected places, a shared love of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, similar views on corporate responsibility, a mutual appreciation for the complexity of global supply chains. Over the next 2 months, I visited Port Arevalo repeatedly. I helped Ayla navigate a customs dispute that had been plaguing her exports. I assisted when her daughter fell ill and needed specialized medical care in the United States. I became not just a business contact, but a trusted friend. When the time came to negotiate a supply agreement, Ayla had one unusual condition: the contract would be with me personally, not with Arcvilas Dynamics. It would be structured as an intermediary representation agreement, with me as the legal intermediary between her laboratory and my company. I trust you, Elena, she had said, not your corporation. The arrangement was unorthodox, but not unprecedented. Arcvilas's legal department, desperate for the supply line, approved the structure with the assumption that it was merely a cultural formality. The contract specified that I, Elena Reyes, would serve as the exclusive representative for the Titan Barate matrix supply. Any change in representation would require written approval from Ayla Vargas. What nobody at Arcvilas bothered to read carefully was the clause that specified this agreement was non-transferable without explicit consent from both parties. In corporate terms, it meant that if I left the company, the supply agreement would not automatically transfer to my replacement or to Arcvilas itself. It would terminate. For 6 years, I had kept this detail to myself, not out of malice or calculation, but because nobody had ever asked. In the corporate world, individuals were indeed seen as cogs, replaceable, interchangeable parts in a greater machine. Why would anyone question whether a supply agreement would survive an individual's departure that Tuesday morning? As Trent Halverson casually dismissed my worth to the company, he had no idea that he was insulting the one person who single-handedly controlled Arcvilas's access to its most critical resource. I left the meeting with mechanical politeness, returning to my office where I closed the door and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of the humiliation. 6 years of dedication. Countless weekends worked, holidays spent on international calls, middle-of-the-night crisis management, all reduced to being just a cog. My office walls were adorned with recognition awards: Supply Chain Manager of the Year, Excellence in International Procurement, Innovation in Logistics. My contribution to Arcvilas's market dominance was undeniable. Our competitors struggled with inconsistent supply of Titan Barate matrix, while our production lines never experienced a single day of shortage. And yet, in Trent's eyes, I was replaceable, a component that could be swapped out at will. I opened my laptop and began typing a resignation letter. 2 sentences were all I needed. Please accept this letter as formal notification that I am resigning from my position as Supply Chain Director with Arcvilas Dynamics. My last day will be Friday, May 17th, 2 weeks from today. No explanation, no expression of gratitude for opportunities provided. no mention of the supply agreement that would collapse upon my departure. Before submitting the letter, I opened my personal safe and removed the original copy of the intermediary representation agreement with Ayla Vargas. The company had a copy, of course, but it was buried in the legal department's archives, its significance unrecognized. I placed the document in my bag, alongside a thumb drive containing all relevant correspondence with the Port Arevalo laboratory. With calculated calm, I walked to HR and handed my resignation letter to Sarah, whose eyes widened in surprise. "Elena, is this because of what happened in the meeting? I'm sure Trent didn't mean." "It's simply time for me to move on," I interrupted, my voice devoid of emotion. "I'll ensure a smooth transition of my regular duties over the next 2 weeks." Regular duties, not the critical supply relationship that couldn't be transitioned. News of my resignation spread quickly. By afternoon, my inbox was flooded with messages from colleagues expressing surprise and concern. The CEO's assistant called to schedule an exit interview. My direct reports stopped by my office, their faces showing genuine distress. Trent Halverson did not contact me at all. I spent the next 2 weeks meticulously documenting standard procedures, creating transition guides, and training my team on everything except the one thing that mattered most. In meetings, I spoke of the Titan Barati matrix supply as if it were a routine vendor relationship that would continue uninterrupted. Nobody thought to question this assumption. On my final Friday, I learned that my replacement would be Bradley Finn, a mid-level manager from another division with no international experience and a reputation for overconfidence. The choice confirmed everything I needed to know about how Trent valued, or rather, devalued my role. I cleared out my office under the sad gazes of my team. There were heartfelt goodbyes, promises to stay in touch, a small farewell gathering with cake in the break room. I accepted it all with gracious smiles and non-committal responses about my future plans. As I walked out of Arcvelis Dynamics for the last time, carrying a box of personal items, I felt neither triumph nor regret. Only the cold certainty that, in the coming weeks, Trent Halverson would learn the true meaning of systems, not people. That evening, I called Ayla Vargas. "Elena, how are you? My friend." Her warm voice carried the familiar slight accent, a mixture of her native Portuguese and the Spanish that dominated Port Arevalo. "I've left Arcvelis," I said simply. A pause. "I see." Her tone shifted, becoming more businesslike. "And our agreement remains between us, as it always has been." Another pause, longer this time. "What would you like me to do when they contact me?" "They won't, at first," I explained. "They'll assume everything continues as before. When they do reach out, you're under no obligation to respond. And if they send someone new, that would be your decision, Ayla. Our agreement doesn't require you to refuse them. It simply doesn't obligate you to accept them either." She chuckled softly. "You know I only worked with Arcvelis because of you. Elena, these big corporations, they think everything is for sale, that relationships are commodities." "Yes," I said. "They think everyone is replaceable. Not you, my friend. Never you." After hanging up, I opened my laptop and navigated to a folder labeled Contingencies. Inside was a document I had prepared 3 years earlier, after the first time a new executive had dismissed the importance of the supply chain department. It contained a detailed analysis of Arcvelis's competitors, their market positions, vulnerabilities, and potential for growth. At the top of that list was Valaris MFG, a smaller but innovative company led by Monique Devery, one of the few female COOs in the industry. I drafted an email to Monique, whom I had met at several industry conferences. The message was simple and direct. I was available for consultation regarding supply chain optimization, particularly concerning specialized materials sourcing from South America. The response came within hours, inviting me to breakfast the following Monday. While I waited for Monday to arrive, Arcvelis Dynamics continued operations, blissfully unaware of the critical failure point I had just created in their supply chain. The current inventory of Titan Barat Matrix would last approximately 6 weeks under normal production conditions. The next scheduled shipment would have been due in 4 weeks, a shipment that would never arrive. Monday morning found me at an upscale cafe near the Valaris headquarters, seated across from Monique Devereux. Unlike Trent, she wasted no time on corporate pleasantries. "I've wanted to poach you for years," she said after we ordered coffee. "What finally happened at Arcvelas to make you leave?" I appreciated her directness. "Let's just say that my contributions were undervalued." She nodded, understanding immediately. "Their loss. But I'm curious about your email. You specifically mentioned South American materials sourcing. I assume you're referring to the Titan Barat Matrix, yes? The same compound that has given Arcvelas a significant competitive advantage for years, the one that my procurement team has been trying to access without success." I sipped my coffee before answering. "The very same." Monique leaned forward, her eyes sharp with interest. "And you believe you can help us secure this supply chain?" "I don't believe, Monique. I know." I removed the intermediary representation agreement from my bag and slid it across the table. "I am the supply chain." She read the document carefully, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise to calculated assessment. When she looked up, a slow smile spread across her face. "You're not here for a consulting position, are you, Elena?" "No. I'm here to propose a partnership. Valaris needs a reliable supply of Titan Barada Matrix to compete effectively with Arcvelas. I can provide that, along with a complete redesign of your logistics framework to optimize the integration of this material." "Euros, and what do you want in return?" "A position as Chief Supply Chain Officer, reporting directly to you, complete autonomy over my department, and a compensation package that reflects the value I bring." Monique didn't hesitate. "Done. When can you start?" "I already have." Back at Arcvelas, the first signs of trouble would be appearing. Bradley Finn would have sent his initial communications to the Port Arevalo laboratory, following the contact protocols documented in my transition materials. Those messages would go unanswered. In a few days, he would escalate to phone calls, which would be politely received by Ayla's assistant but never returned. As the 4-week mark approached, Bradley would begin to panic, finally alerting Trent Halverson to the potential supply disruption. Trent, with his limited understanding of the supply chain's complexity, would likely dismiss the concerns initially. "Find another supplier," he might say, not realizing that the Titan Barat Matrix was available from only one source. Meanwhile, at Valaris, I worked with focused intensity. Within 2 weeks, I had established a new supply agreement between Ayla Vargas and Valaris MFG. The first shipment of Titan Barat Matrix was already en route to Valaris's production facilities. I restructured their entire logistics operation, implementing efficiencies that would allow them to maximize the value of the new material. Monique gave me the resources and autonomy I needed, trusting my expertise without question. In our daily interactions, she demonstrated what Trent Halverson had failed to understand in a complex global business. People are not interchangeable parts. Relationships, expertise, and trust cannot be replicated by systems alone. 5 weeks after my departure from Arcvelas, the company held an emergency all-hands meeting. I heard about it from former colleagues who still kept in touch. Trent Halverson stood before the assembled employees, using phrases like temporary supply chain disruption and strategic sourcing realignment. Behind the corporate jargon lay a simple, devastating truth: production had stopped. Without the Titan Barat Matrix, Arcvelas couldn't manufacture its core products. By week 6, customers began to notice. Orders went unfulfilled. Delivery dates were pushed back. Competitors, primarily Valaris, started to receive inquiries from Arcvelas's frustrated clients. On the stock market, Arcvelas shares dropped as analysts raised concerns about production capabilities. Trent dispatched a team to Port Arevalo, led by Bradley Finn. They returned empty-handed. Ayla Vargas had met with them briefly, explaining that her laboratory had entered an exclusive agreement with another company. When asked about the previous arrangement with Arcvelas, She simply referenced the intermediary representation agreement, which had terminated with my departure. Legal teams were consulted. Options were explored, but the agreement had been clear: no transfer without consent from both parties. My consent had never been sought, and now it was too late. In week 8, Arcvelis announced a strategic restructuring. 300 employees were laid off. Production facilities operated at minimal capacity, using the last reserves of Titan Barat matrix for only the highest priority orders. Week 12 brought the first executive departures. The CFO resigned, followed by several vice presidents. Trent Halverson was quietly removed from his position, though no public announcement was made. By week 16, Arcvelis Dynamics filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, citing severe supply chain disruptions as the primary cause. The company that had dominated its market for a decade was now fighting for survival. Its value diminished, its future uncertain. Throughout this collapse, I remained silent. I gave no interviews, made no public statements, engaged in no gloating. The business press speculated about the connection between my departure and Arcvelis's downfall, but I offered no confirmation or denial. Instead, I focused on building something new at Valaris. With access to the Titan Barat matrix, the company quickly expanded its product line and market share. We hired several talented individuals who had been let go from Arcvelis, including some of my former team members. The company grew, prospered, and established itself as the new industry leader. 6 months after leaving Arcvelis, I returned to Port Arevalo for a scheduled meeting with Isla Vargas. We sat at a small cafe overlooking the ocean, discussing the details of our ongoing partnership. I heard Arcvelis is being sold in pieces. Ayla mentioned as we finished our tea. Assets liquidated, patents acquired by competitors. A sad end for such a company. I nodded, feeling neither satisfaction nor remorse. They failed to value what was truly important. And at Valaris, do they appreciate you properly? They do. I smiled for the first time that day. Monique understands that relationships and expertise matter, that people aren't just interchangeable parts. Ayla reached across the table and patted my hand. Good. You deserve that recognition, my friend. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the colonial buildings of Port Arevalo, I signed a renewed long-term agreement between Ayla's laboratory and Valaris MFG. The terms were favorable to both parties, built on mutual respect and recognition of value. I never was a cog. I was the oil that kept the entire machine running. And when I was gone, it ceased to function. Looking back now, I realized that Trent Halverson taught me an invaluable lesson that Tuesday morning. He showed me that no matter how essential you are, some people will never see your worth. Some will reduce you to a function, a role, a replaceable part in their grand design. But the truth reveals itself in time. Systems don't build relationships. Processes don't solve unique problems. Organizational charts don't create trust. People do. And not just any people, the right people, in the right positions, with the right recognition. I didn't destroy Arcvelis out of vengeance, though many might interpret it that way. I simply removed myself from an equation that had failed to acknowledge my value. The collapse that followed was not my doing, but the natural consequence of a flawed understanding of how business truly works. As for Trent Halverson, I heard he found a new executive position at a smaller company in another industry. I wish him well and hope he's learned what I always knew in the intricate machinery of global business. It's dangerous to mistake the essential for the expendable. Because sometimes what looks like a mere cog is actually the key that holds everything together. The weeks following Arcvelis's bankruptcy filing were chaotic for the industry. Competitors scrambled to acquire portions of the company's client base. Suppliers sought new partnerships. Former employees updated their resumes and LinkedIn profiles, many adding the phrase "former Arcvelis Dynamics" with a mixture of pride and disappointment. Media coverage was extensive. Business analysts dissected the company's downfall, focusing primarily on the supply chain failure. Some reports mentioned my name, noting the correlation between my departure and the beginning of Arkvelis's troubles. A few more investigative pieces uncovered the unusual intermediary representation agreement with the Port Arevalo Laboratory, raising questions about corporate oversight and risk management. One particularly insightful article in the Wall Street Journal quoted an anonymous former Arkvelis executive. The company operated under the dangerous assumption that individuals were replaceable. In reality, certain key relationships were built on personal trust that couldn't be transferred through normal corporate succession planning. Trent Halverson declined all interview requests. His LinkedIn profile was updated to list a new position as Chief Strategy Officer at a mid-sized manufacturing company in the Midwest. Far from the aerospace and defense industries where his name had become synonymous with catastrophic management failure. At Valaris, we maintained a professional silence about Arkvelis's collapse. Monique fielded media inquiries with diplomatic responses about market opportunities and Valaris's long-term growth strategy. When asked about hiring me and subsequently securing the Titan Barate matrix supply, she simply stated, "Valaris recognizes talent and values expertise. Elena Reyes brings both to our executive team." My own response to inquiries was even more restrained. I'm focused on building Valaris's future, not discussing Arkvelis's past. This public discretion did not extend to our private celebrations. As Valaris secured major contracts and expanded production capabilities, Monique ensured that contributions were recognized and rewarded. My supply chain team received substantial bonuses when we completed the logistics restructuring ahead of schedule. When we negotiated favorable terms with a network of global suppliers, expanding beyond the Titan Barat matrix to other specialized materials, the achievement was announced company-wide with appropriate acknowledgement of individual efforts. People before systems, Monique often said in our executive meetings. Systems serve people, not the other way around. 9 months after joining Valaris, I received an unexpected email from Sarah, my former HR contact at Arkvelis. She had landed on her feet at a consulting firm and wanted to meet for coffee. Curious, I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe midway between our offices. After brief personal updates, Sarah got to the point. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said, stirring her latte absently. "Did you know what would happen when you left about the supply agreement with Port Arevalo?" I considered my response carefully. I was aware of the terms of the agreement, yes. "And you didn't tell anyone?" "Not even as you were leaving." "No one asked," I replied simply. In 6 years, no one ever asked about the specific legal structure of that supply relationship. It was documented in the files, available for anyone who cared to look. Sarah nodded slowly. "After you left, when things started falling apart, legal found the agreement. There was a huge internal investigation. They couldn't believe no one had identified this as a key person risk. And what conclusion did they reach? That the company had failed to perform proper due diligence, that systems had been prioritized over understanding critical relationships." She paused. Trent was crucified in the final report, but the board didn't escape blame either. The culture of treating people as interchangeable parts was cited as a fundamental weakness. I sipped my coffee, letting the information settle. "Expensive lesson." "Very." Sarah hesitated, then asked, "Are you glad about what happened to Arkvelis?" The question deserved an honest answer. "No, Sarah. I'm not glad that a company failed. I'm not glad that people lost jobs. But I'm satisfied that a flawed perspective was exposed. Companies aren't just balance sheets and organizational charts. They're collections of relationships, expertise, and trust. When leadership forgets that, consequences follow." She studied me for a moment. "You know, after that meeting, the one where Trent called you a cog, I went to him and said he'd made a mistake, that he'd insulted one of our most valuable executives. Do you know what he said?" I shook my head. He said, "No one is irreplaceable. The sooner everyone accepts that, the stronger our culture will be." I think about that now. And she trailed off, shaking her head. And I wonder if he still believes it. I didn't need to wonder. People like Trent Halverson rarely change their fundamental worldview. Even when confronted with its catastrophic failure, they simply find new explanations that preserve their core beliefs while accounting for the unexpected outcome. In Trent's mind, Arkvelis hadn't failed because he undervalued a key executive. It had failed because of an unusual legal arrangement, or insufficient risk management, or market forces beyond anyone's control. "How are things at Valaris?" Sarah asked, changing the subject. "Different," I replied. Monique has built a culture that recognizes individual contributions while still maintaining cohesive teamwork. People aren't cogs there, they're craftspeople, each with unique skills and value. "Sounds nice," Sarah said with a wistful smile. "They hiring in HR?" I smiled back. "I can check." 2 weeks later, Sarah joined Valaris as Deputy HR Director. She brought with her valuable insights from Arkvelis's collapse, helping Valaris avoid similar pitfalls as the company expanded rapidly. Her first major project was developing a key relationship mapping protocol that identified critical personal connections within the company's operational framework, ensuring that succession planning accounted for these essential but often invisible bonds. 1 year after Arkvelis's bankruptcy, Valaris had doubled in size and tripled its market value. We had absorbed much of Arkvelis's former market share and expanded into adjacent sectors. The Titan Barat matrix remained a cornerstone of our product line, but we had diversified our materials sourcing to include other specialized compounds from global suppliers. Each supply relationship was carefully structured with appropriate redundancies and clear understanding of the personal connections involved. My department had grown from 12 people to 47, with specialized teams handling different aspects of the global supply chain. I made a point of knowing each team member personally, understanding their strengths, recognizing their contributions, and ensuring they felt valued not just as functions, but as individuals. In my office now, a corner suite with views rivaling those at Arkvelis, I kept only one memento from my previous position, a small gear from an antique clock, mounted in a clear acrylic case. It sat on my desk as a reminder of Trent's words and the costly lesson that followed. Occasionally, a visitor would ask about its significance, and I would simply say it was a personal reminder about the true nature of business relationships. 18 months after leaving Arkvelis, I received an invitation to speak at an industry conference on resilient supply chain management in a global economy. The organizer mentioned that the event would include a panel discussion on the Arkvelis case study, and thought my insights would be valuable. After consulting with Monique, who saw it as an opportunity to enhance Valaris's industry leadership position, I accepted. The conference was held at a luxury hotel in Singapore, bringing together executives and experts from around the world. My keynote address focused on the integration of technological systems with human expertise, emphasizing that the most resilient supply chains combined robust processes with strong personal relationships. Without mentioning Arkvelis directly, I outlined the dangers of over-reliance on systems while undervaluing the human elements of global commerce. The panel discussion the following day was more direct in its examination of Arkvelis's collapse. The moderator, a respected business school professor, had assembled a group that included a former Arkvelis board member, a supply chain academic, and an industry analyst. I rounded out the panel as the current industry practitioner. "Ms. Reyes," the moderator began, "you left Arkvelis shortly before the supply chain issues that ultimately led to its bankruptcy. From your current perspective at Valaris, what do you see as the key lessons from that situation?" All eyes turned to me, the audience leaning forward in anticipation. Many had come specifically for this panel, curious about the inside story of a major corporate collapse. "The fundamental lesson," I replied, "is that business is built on relationships, not just transactions. Systems and processes are essential, but they serve to support human connections, not replace them. When a company fails to recognize the value of these relationships, when it treats people as interchangeable parts in a machine, it creates vulnerability." The former board member shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That's somewhat simplistic, isn't it? Arkvelis had a sophisticated supply chain management system. The issue was an unusual legal arrangement that created unexpected dependency on a single individual. I turned to face him directly. With respect, that perspective misses the point. The legal arrangement wasn't the root cause, it was a symptom. The question isn't why one supply agreement was structured unusually. The question is why no one in leadership recognized its importance for 6 years. Why was there no curiosity about how this critical relationship actually functioned? Are you suggesting that leadership was negligent? The moderator asked. I'm suggesting that leadership operated under a flawed paradigm. They saw the organization as a machine composed of interchangeable parts. This led them to focus on systems while overlooking the human elements that made those systems work. The industry analyst jumped in. But surely individuals have responsibility too. If you knew this arrangement created risk for the company, didn't you have an obligation to highlight it? The question was direct, challenging. The audience waited for my response. The arrangement was documented and available to anyone who asked. In 6 years, no one did. I paused, then continued more deliberately. But you raise an important point about responsibility. Every executive, myself included, has an obligation to act in the best interests of their organization. The question becomes, what constitutes best interests? Is it short-term continuity, long-term resilience, shareholder value, organizational health? And how would you answer that question? The moderator prompted. I believe an organization's best interests are served when it values its people appropriately. When it recognizes that expertise, relationships, and trust are assets as real as any on the balance sheet. When it understands that calling someone just a cog fundamentally mischaracterizes their contribution. A murmur went through the audience. The board member's expression tightened, but he remained silent. The academic on the panel, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. What I find fascinating about the Archvilas case is how it exemplifies what we call the paradox of systemization. The more a company tries to make its operations person-independent to create systems that can run regardless of who's in a particular role, the more vulnerable it becomes to the loss of specific individuals who understand how those systems actually work. It's not the formal processes that matter most, but the informal knowledge and relationships that make them effective. I nodded in agreement. Exactly. At Valaris, we've implemented what we call relationship-aware systems, processes that acknowledge and support the human connections that drive business success, rather than attempting to render them obsolete. The discussion continued for another 40 minutes, exploring various aspects of supply chain resilience and organizational design. Throughout, I maintained a professional tone, never directly criticizing Trent Halverson or other Archvilas executives by name, focusing instead on structural and cultural factors. After the panel, several attendees approached me with questions and comments. Most were supply chain professionals interested in how Valaris had structured its relationship-aware systems. A few were former Archvilas employees, now working for competitors, who wanted to share their own perspectives on the company's collapse. As the crowd thinned, I noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the room. Trent Halverson, looking somewhat diminished in a suit that wasn't quite as perfectly tailored as I remembered. Waited until the last attendee had left before approaching. Elena, he said, extending his hand. Interesting panel. I shook his hand briefly. Trent, I didn't know you were attending the conference. Last-minute decision. I'm consulting now, helping companies optimize their organizational structures. A trace of the old confidence returned to his voice. Your comments about systems versus relationships were provocative. But accurate, I replied. He shrugged. Perhaps. Though I think you underestimate the importance of institutional frameworks. Archvilas' failure wasn't just about undervaluing people. There were multiple factors: market pressures, strategic miscalculations, unusual contractual arrangements. Even now, he couldn't see it. Or wouldn't admit it. What brings you to Singapore, Trent, business or pleasure? A bit of both. I'm meeting with potential clients while I'm here. He hesitated, then added. I've been following Valaris' growth. Impressive results? Thank you. An awkward silence fell between us. Finally, Trent spoke again, his tone more subdued. Do you ever think about how things might have been different if you had stayed at Archvilas? The question surprised me. It was the closest he had come to acknowledging the connection between my departure and the company's downfall. I think about the people, I answered honestly. The teams that were disrupted, the careers that were derailed. But the company itself, no. Archvilas had structural problems that went beyond any individual. My leaving might have accelerated the collapse, but the weaknesses were already there. Trent nodded slowly. Well, I should be going. I have a dinner engagement. He extended his hand again. Good luck with Valaris, though it seems you don't need it. As he walked away, I wondered if he had learned anything from the experience, if he now understood that calling someone just a cog wasn't just insulting. It was a fundamental misreading of how organizations actually function. Somehow, I doubted it. Back at Valaris, we continued to expand and innovate. 2 years after joining the company, I was promoted to Executive Vice President of Global Operations, with responsibility not just for supply chain, but for manufacturing and distribution as well. Monique and I worked closely together, building an organization that combined systematic efficiency with human connection. Our partnership with Ayla Vargas's laboratory deepened and evolved. With Valaris's support, she expanded her research capabilities, developing new variations of the Titan Barati matrix with enhanced properties. Each innovation strengthened our market position and created new opportunities for growth. The remnants of Archvilas were eventually acquired by a consortium of investors who broke the company into smaller entities focused on specific product lines. None achieved the market dominance that Archvilas had once enjoyed. The name gradually faded from industry discussions, becoming a case study in business schools rather than a competitive force in the market. 3 years after that fateful Tuesday morning when Trent Halverson called me just a cog, I stood in Valaris's newest production facility, watching as the first batch of components using Ayla's latest formulation moved through the assembly line. The factory hummed with activity, each person playing their unique role in a complex but harmonious process. Sarah, now our Chief Human Resources Officer, stood beside me, observing the operation. Remarkable, isn't it? She said. How it all works together. It is, I agreed. You know what I was thinking about this morning? That meeting at Archvilas, the cog comment. I smiled slightly. Ancient history. Not so ancient, 3 years. But look at the difference. She gestured toward the production floor. Here, everyone knows they matter, that their specific contribution is valued. It changes everything: quality, innovation, efficiency. It does. I saw Trent's name in the news last week. Sarah continued. His consulting firm is filing for bankruptcy. Apparently, they promised organizational transformations they couldn't deliver. I wasn't surprised. Trent's fundamental misunderstanding of how organizations work would inevitably limit his effectiveness as a consultant. You can't help companies value relationships when you don't value them yourself. Elena, Sarah said, her tone turning serious. I need to tell you something. Back at Archvilas, after you left and things started falling apart, there was a meeting. Trent tried to blame you for not disclosing the nature of the Port Arevalo agreement. He wanted to pursue legal action against you for breach of fiduciary duty. This was news to me. What happened? Legal shut it down immediately. The agreement was properly documented in the company files. You hadn't hidden anything. Their failure to understand its importance wasn't your responsibility. She paused. But Trent was furious. He kept saying you had deliberately sabotaged the company. I considered this information. And what do you think, Sarah? She looked me directly in the eyes. I think you did exactly what any self-respecting professional would do when their value is dismissed. You took your talents elsewhere. The consequences that followed were the result of Archvilas's failure to understand what they had in you. I nodded, appreciating her perspective. Let's make sure we never make the same mistake here. We won't, Sarah assured me. Every manager at Valaris now goes through what we call the COG training. a program that teaches them to recognize and value the unique contributions of each team member. We don't use that term, of course, but the lesson is clear. No one is just anything in this organization. As we continued our tour of the facility, greeting employees by name and acknowledging their work, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The humiliation of that Tuesday morning had transformed into something unexpectedly positive, not just professional success at Valaris, but a deeper understanding of organizational dynamics that I now shared with others. In the years that followed, I occasionally encountered former Arcvilas colleagues at industry events. Some had found success elsewhere, others had struggled to rebuild their careers after the company's collapse. A few expressed resentment toward me, believing I had somehow orchestrated Arcvilas' downfall out of spite. Most, however, recognized that the company's failure had stemmed from systemic issues rather than individual actions. 5 years after leaving Arcvilas, I received a message from Ayla Vargas that contained only a link to a news article. The headline read, "Former Arcvilas COO Trent Halverson joins Port Arevalo Development Corporation as strategic advisor." I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Trent was now working in the very region whose importance he had failed to recognize, likely attempting to establish the relationships he had once dismissed as replaceable. I wished him success, genuinely. Perhaps this experience would teach him what Arcvilas could not. My own path continued to evolve. When Monique Devereaux was appointed CEO of Valaris' parent company, I succeeded her as president and COO of Valaris MFG. Under my leadership, the company expanded its global footprint, establishing production facilities in strategic locations around the world, each built on carefully cultivated relationships with local suppliers, governments, and communities. The small gear in its acrylic case remained on my desk. Though its significance had changed, it no longer represented an insult or a lesson about corporate failure. Instead, it reminded me of transformation, how a painful moment had catalyzed a journey that benefited not just me, but hundreds of others who now worked in an organization that truly valued their contributions. 7 years after that Tuesday morning meeting, I returned to Port Arevalo for the opening of a new research center that Valaris had built in partnership with Ayla's laboratory. The state-of-the-art facility would explore applications of the Titan Barat matrix beyond our current product lines, potentially opening new markets and opportunities. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Ayla and I walked along the cliff path overlooking the Pacific, the same route we had taken during my first visit many years earlier. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked, gesturing toward the gleaming research center behind us. "When you first came here, trying to secure a supply agreement for Arcvilas?" I shook my head. Never. I was just trying to solve a problem, to establish a relationship that would benefit both sides. And now look what that relationship has built. She smiled, the years having added wisdom to her features without diminishing her sharp intelligence. All because you understood what so many corporate people do not, that business is about people, not just profits and processes. "I had a good teacher," I replied. As we continued our walk, I spotted a familiar figure in the distance, standing at the viewpoint overlooking the ocean. Trent Halverson, older now, his hair graying at the temples, turned as we approached. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Elena," he said, his surprise evident. "And Dr. Vargas, what a coincidence." "Not entirely," Ayla replied. "This is the best view in Port Arevalo. Many visitors find their way here." An uncomfortable silence followed. Finally, Trent spoke again. "I saw the opening ceremony from my hotel. Impressive facility." "Thank you," I said. "It represents years of collaboration between Valaris and Dr. Vargas's laboratory." Trent nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've been working with the Development Corporation here for about 6 months, trying to attract new investment to the region." "And how is that going?" Ayla asked, her tone neutral. "Slowly," he admitted. "Establishing the right relationships takes time." I caught Ayla's eye, sharing a moment of silent understanding. The irony of Trent's statement wasn't lost on either of us. "Well," Trent said, clearly eager to end the encounter, I should be getting back. Meetings this afternoon. Congratulations again on the research center. As he walked away, Ayla turned to me. Did he ever apologize for what he said to you at Arkvelis? No, I replied, and I never expected him to. Does it bother you, seeing him here? I considered the question carefully. No. Whatever happened between us is in the past. We've both moved forward, just in different directions. Ayla nodded, satisfied with my answer. You know, Elena, in all our years of working together, you've never told me exactly what he said that made you leave Arkvelis. I smiled, remembering the moment that had changed everything. He called me just a cog in the machine. Ayla laughed, the sound carrying on the ocean breeze. A cog. My friend. He couldn't have been more wrong. No, I agreed, looking back at the research center that stood as testament to the power of human connection. He couldn't have been. As we continued our walk along the cliff path, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. From supply chain analyst to company president, from being called just a cog to building an organization that valued every individual's unique contribution. I never set out to bankrupt Arkvelis. I had simply removed myself from an equation that failed to recognize my worth. The collapse that followed wasn't my doing, but the inevitable consequence of a fundamental misunderstanding about how business actually works. I wasn't a cog, I was the oil that kept the entire machine running, and when I left, it ceased to function. That was the lesson. Not that individuals should seek revenge when undervalued, but that organizations must recognize the true nature of their strength, not in systems alone, but in the people who build, maintain, and improve those systems. Not in organizational charts, but in the relationships that bring those structures to life. As Ayla and I reached the end of the cliff path, looking out over the endless Pacific, I felt a sense of completion. The circle that began with that humiliating Tuesday morning had closed, transformed into something better than I could have imagined. I had never been a cog, and now everyone knew it.